Hello, my name's Jon Addison. I'm the Senior Curator of History at the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery. I'm also very proud to be a custodian of the QVMAG Guan Di Temple, which is a very, very important Tasmanian temple. It's a hybrid temple, so it's not just purely Buddhist, it's Buddhist, Taoist and Confucian in the way that the worship here works. And it's dedicated to the deity Guan Di. So we can start our tour by having a look at the banner that you can see in the corridor outside the temple. Now that one is a reproduction because of course textiles do not survive well in large amounts of light and long-term display. So that one's a reproduction, but it's actually a really interesting item because the temple was donated to the people of Launceston in 1934. It doesn't have the normal sort of official donation form. What it's got is that banner, which actually tells you that the temple was donated by the residents of Tin Mountain, which is what the Chinese residents called, in Cantonese, the area in northeast Tasmania where the tin mining took place, to the people of Launceston. And it has representations of the god of wealth on it. And so we reproduced that so it could stay on permanent display. Now the temple itself is quite interesting because what we've done with the temple is tried to represent it like most of the temples in the northeast would have appeared. It has plain cut wooden walls, which we've put on there to represent the way they looked. And these temples may have had very, very important and valuable items inside them, but they were basically just slab huts in the bush. And all of these temples had a veranda. And it was because temples need a light well, an anteroom area. And all of the Tasmanian temples appeared to have had, and in fact all the Australian temples that we've seen evidence of appear to have this kind of veranda that's actually a V shape with a sort of gully at the back. We can't represent that here inside, but the temple needs that anteroom space, which is why there's a gap before you go into the temple. Inside the temple, you can see it's quite overwhelming actually. There's a lot of material in here. Most of the items that you can see in the temple here were imported from China. Pretty much all of them would have come from Guangzhou in Guangdong province, because that's the major urban centre that most of the people's villages that they came from would have surrounded. Most of the people who came out didn't speak Mandarin. They were southerners, and they spoke Cantonese, or more likely, in many cases, most of them spoke Siyup. And so it did mean that not everybody was actually able to understand everybody else who came out. So most of the people who were working in this part of Tasmania were from that one region, and they were mostly Siyup speakers. So I'm going to start and take you through some of the items that you can see. If we turn to the left, one of the more impressive items you can see is a large float of a golden palace. This is actually known as a choi moon, or a carved wooden wall hanging. And it's, I suppose, a bit of a vision of heaven. And it's the sort of thing that would have hung, not necessarily directly on the wall, but actually freestanding as you entered a temple. We think this one probably came from Garibaldi, but we're not entirely sure. These were small buildings. This was a very intricately carved and elaborate piece of temple decoration. So it's really giving an idea of the sort of the importance that religion played in the lives of the miners and business people who operated in the northeast. Next to the horse and below some of the plaques on the walls, you can see 3 ceremonial weapons. These are not real weapons. You can see that the glaive-like item on the left is actually made largely of papier-mâché. These represent the military aspect of Guan Di, who was actually a real person, and he served as a general during the Three Kingdoms period of Chinese history. And this is what made him particularly famous. Next to those weapons, there's a big brass one with the red shaft. Now that is a type of weapon called a Guan Dao, which translates as Guan blade, and that was actually named after Guan Di. Now Guan Di's actual given name was Guan Yu, Guan Di is representing him in his guise as emperor within the Buddhist pantheon. So Guan Di as a god is the correct term there, but Guan Yu was the name of the land. So these weapons were actually named after him. His one was known as the Qinglong Yen Wei Dao, the green dragon crescent blade. And this particular one is obviously not capable of cutting anything because it doesn't have an edge. It's rounded. So this is a purely ceremonial piece imported from China to go in one of the temples. But it represents Guan Di in a particular way because he was well known as being fabulously strong. And so the guandao is known as being essentially a training weapon, very strong, very heavy, and ultimately impractical for actual battle, but great for building up strength in training. He was known to be someone who actually used it because he was so strong. Now, interestingly, behind that, you can actually see another sort of item on a pole. Now, that used to hold a banner. We still have the banner in the museum's collection, but we've had to take some of the textile items off display because textiles on display for too long get damaged by light and conditions and require quite a lot of conservation work. And it's one of the ongoing challenges of looking after a temple of this age and significance. Next to that, you can see a fan. That fan, again, it's a ceremonial item, but it's the sort of thing that would be used in a procession. If you took the figurine of the deity out for a procession for a special day, you would have people carrying fans and people carrying parasols to keep the sun off the deity. So those represent the ceremonial function. Now, what's interesting is when I mention a figurine of Guan Di, we haven't got one. This temple does not appear to actually have one. It's quite unusual in that respect. What we do have, though, is a particularly beautiful artwork showing Guan Di and his sons, which is in the main altar at the back. That one, again, the image we're showing in there is a very exact reproduction. The original is in storage because it's a watercolour on paper and it's quite prone to damage. It's also a very beautiful item. On the right of the main altar, you can see an item in a frame with orange background and text on it. That's the sort of declaration of the official nature of these temples. I say these temples because this temple actually contains the remains of 6 temples in the northeast. But that would be the one from Weldborough where everything ended up. In front of it, you can see a box with an elaborate red wooden frame type system on the top of it. That houses an item called a chop. And the chop is the official seal of the temple. And it's interesting because it illustrates that these temples didn't just have religious functions. The temples had official functions as well. They were very important places for the administration of the local area. So that's a particularly important item because that was used to stamp official documents as well as things relating to the temple. Next to the altar on the right, you can see an item that's quite interesting. It's a gong. Now, most temples have gongs, but this one is interesting because it's not all imported. Of course, the gong itself would have been made by a professional gong maker in Guangdong. But if you look at the frame around it, most of the frame and probably the base was made locally. And when you look at it more carefully, you realise it's a bicycle wheel rim. It's of the type that was known as a Westwood rim, and we can use that to actually date it to the 1880s. Which is when those bicycle rims were in use. And it's been used as the frame to suspend the gong. At some point, probably not originally, but later in its use life, the gong was actually suspended using very early electrical cables wrapped in fabric. We've actually got it hanging from wires, but have left the original cabling there. So that's a really fantastic example of the kind of make, do and mend that people were doing when they were in the bush, living a very difficult, hard life using hard labour. They were adapting what they could find around them for use and to continue their culture and their cultural life. To the right of the gong, you can see some other items that look as they're sort of like banners. These banners represent the 8 immortals and the 8 ordinary symbols. So each one of these items has a hidden symbol in it. Some of them are fairly obvious, but they're all sort of hidden in the embroidery. These are really, really rare and important items. They're made of gold couched thread. It's actual genuine gold thread. A lot of these items are quite symbolic in Buddhist and Taoist philosophy. In one of them, you can see a book. It's one of the 8 Buddhist treasures and represents scholarly learning. You can see a rhinoceros horn in the one below that, and that's one of the 8 ordinary symbols, and that represents happiness. There are also symbols that represent particular people. The emblem of the immortal Li Tie Gao is a gourd. And I should point out here that the immortals, it didn't mean they were actually immortal in life, but it meant they became immortalized. And they're very important figures and appear on a huge amount of symbolism in Chinese art. Now, directly above them, you can see a plaque. That plaque is red with gold characters on it and a gold border. And that one is actually very interesting because it's been located there in this temple for most of the temple's operational life. However, what's interesting is it's in the wrong spot. And at some point it will probably be moved into the correct spot. It should be above the temple's door. And the reason is that it reads Guan Di Miao. And Guan Di Miao means Guan Di Temple. So it's the official sign on the temple saying that this temple is dedicated to Guan Di. Now, Guan Di is a very important figure because virtually all Australian temples were dedicated to Guan Di. There are so many other Chinese deities. Why were they all dedicated to this one figure? When you look at Guan Di's background and history, he's not immediately obvious as a figure to be worshipped by overseas Chinese, which is one of the terms that is used for Chinese immigrants who were working in Australia or in the New World. Guan Di was actually a warrior. He started off as a bean curd seller and became a very famous warrior and then a general during the Three Kingdoms period. So a lot of people regard him as a god of war. He's not really a war god. His power is actually to prevent war and to cast out demons. So despite being also associated with war and that kind of strength, he's also associated with learning. He was well known as being highly learned, but his main association relates to an episode called the Meeting in the Peach Garden, where he swore brotherhood to 2 friends who were unrelated to him. That element of brotherhood, of bringing unrelated people together, is what made him an important figure for people who were far away from their homelands trying to make enough money to send back to their families to keep them alive. Now, in front of the main altar, you can see the front altar, and it's got some very interesting items on it. The most important item on there is, of course, the incense pot. It's made of a special mix of pewter. That's why a whole lot of the items in this temple are made of this interesting grey pewter. It's a special metal that was reserved for temple use. The incense pots are really important because the burning of incense is also a really important part of worship in these sorts of temples, because it's through the incense smoke that your prayers and your thoughts are taken up to heaven, and not just to the main deity of the temple, not just to Guan Di, but to your ancestors. That is one of the key tenets of worship. Now, because this is not just a purely Buddhist temple, it's a Buddhist Taoist temple, there are a whole lot of other interesting things on here. Other than the candlesticks and things, you can see these little bamboo buckets with bamboo sticks in them. Those are called Kao Kim, and they are divining sticks. It's still a practice that you find in a lot of countries in Southeast Asia. The Chinese population of Tasmania was actually a significant proportion of the population during the height of mining during the 1880s. Now, it doesn't mean there are a lot of people, but it was a significant number, and it was the largest non-European group in the state. During the height of the tin mining boom, over 1,000 Chinese people lived in the northeast, and some people had set up business in Launceston and the other major centres, supplying and servicing their countrymen. Not only their countrymen, actually, most of the main Chinese business owners served everybody. But the temples gradually closed as less and less people took up mining, because the populations just weren't large enough to support regular use. So what would happen is, because there were very, very valuable and important items in them, they'd be moved to another temple. And because most of these temples were very small, most items were moved to Wellborough. Wellborough was a much bigger temple. So the items were accumulated there, but gradually, the population in those areas of both Chinese and non-Chinese people declined because the mining declined. Eventually, the temple's custodian, a man known as Ji Han, decided he wanted to go back to China. So he approached one of his countrymen in Launceston, a man called James Chong, who was a very influential businessman and grocer, about the idea of moving the contents to Launceston. James Chong was very supportive of this idea. James Chong was also a Baptist lay preacher. He had converted, he was Christian, but he recognised the contents of the temple as being a really important part of his Chinese heritage, and he wanted to save it. It wasn't just James Chong, there were a whole group of people who were responsible for getting this very valuable collection moved. And it was donated to the city, to the people of Launceston, with the primary aim of being a place of worship for the Chinese population, because there was a significant Chinese population in Launceston at the time. So it was 1934 when it was first moved, and because the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery is run by the local city council, it was the obvious place for the items to be set up and this annex built to house the whole collection. This temple is still regarded as a working temple. Now, it doesn't mean that it has a serving monk here, but it does mean that it has never actually been closed for worship. So anyone who wishes to is actually welcome to worship in this space. The temple isn't used regularly by the local Chinese population because their ancestors are not represented here. There's almost no one in Launceston that descends from the Chinese miners who set up this temple. But it's still a really important link to the past. It's a link to Launceston's shared heritage. This is everybody's heritage, because we have to acknowledge that the history of Launceston is not just a European history, it's a multicultural history. And we really want to make sure that we represent in this space so that people recognise there have been people of many different nationalities around for many years. So we'd encourage you to spend some time in this space, having a look at the items and thinking about how they relate to the lives of those in the past who brought them out at great expense from the other side of the world, and to reflect on the place of religion as a social glue for the people who moved to Tasmania from so far away and became an integral part of the local community.